Welcome to CISO Conversations, EU Data Regulations. I'm your host, Kev Johnson. If you, like so many IT leaders out there, are seeking ways to navigate the new EU data regulations, this is for you. In each episode, you'll hear from people like yourself, regulation contributors and writers, and leading experts on data security on how the upcoming rollout of multiple data regulations in the EU is putting everyone's minds to the test. Today, we're covering the topic of DORA versus NIS2, the big battle of the 2024 data regulations giants. To help us understand this better, we have EMEA Field CISO, Richard Cassidy, and Jack Poller, ESG Analyst, in the studio, sharing how the fast-approaching compliance deadlines for NIS2 and DORA are, or should be, influencing the day-to-day decision-making of IT leaders. We'll keep today's episode short, sweet, and to the point. If you want just one brain twister from today's episode, make sure to flip your ears forward when Richard explains why it's not only financial organisations that should be compliant with DORA. Enjoy.
I'm Jack Poller, Senior Analyst with Enterprise Strategy Group. Joining me today is Richard Cassidy from Rubrik. Richard, can you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Certainly. Thanks very much. So I am Field CISO with Rubrik. So my role is combining really a lot of what I've done in the past couple of decades and helping CISOs and C-suite better understand how to build cyber resilience and data security strategies.
Excellent. Well, I think you'll be great to sort of help me and the audience understand DORA and NIS2. So I thought we'd start with sort of the very basics that DORA is an EU regulation and Network and Information Security NIS2 directive is a directive. What's sort of the difference between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there does tend to be a little bit of misunderstanding. Well, I say a lot from the conversations, at least I'm having with customers and executive suite stakeholders. So a directive, put in simplistic terms I possibly can, is an act that will set goals for EU countries to achieve. But the good thing about a directive, depends which way you look at it, is it gives those organizations flexibility in how they implement those goals in their national laws. So some directives may not make it to national law. There may just be a framework that organizations have to follow. Others will make it in there. And as such, there'll be some repercussions around not meeting the directive. Where legislation is quite a broad term, and it does include directives in some cases, but it's more about EU regulations and decisions which are directly applicable in EU countries, and they don't need to be transposed into national law as they're a binding entity across all EU countries. So much more resolute, and certainly you have to focus on legislation first and foremost, and then directives beyond that.
Excellent. So then let's sort of start with the regulation, which is DORA, which would be the Digital Operational Resilience Act. Can you sort of give us, what's the sort of elevator pitch? What is it about, and why should we care about it?
So DORA is, I think, one of the first regulations that really help companies gain a specific outcome, a tangible outcome in terms of cyber resilience, cybersecurity posture. So what it stands for is the Digital Operational Resilience Act, and it's a very comprehensive regulation for the EU member states that essentially enhances the resilience of the financial sector and mainly against digital disruption, cybersecurity threats. The interesting thing is, don't misunderstand where DORA sits. DORA may be focused on financial institutions or sectors rather, but if you're an organization that provides services into DORA sector companies and stakeholders, then you may well also have to align to the DORA principles. But at a very high level, it essentially includes pretty much every financial market participant you can think of, right? So banks, insurance companies, investment firms, cryptocurrency exchanges, et cetera, and it really primarily wants these organizations to have assurance that they can withstand and rapidly recover from potential technology disruptions and system failures. And the real driver behind that is for the EU to maintain a stable and secure financial environment, which is pretty important.
Yeah. And then now NIS2 is sort of the second version of NIS. So maybe more people are familiar with it, but let's sort of give sort of that same sort of overview of the NIS2 directive.
Yeah, it's a great point. And NIS2 really does represent a significant evolution from NIS. And a lot of people may be looking at, well, I say maybe, we'll certainly be looking at making sure they align with NIS2 directives come October of this year when the deadline hits. And there's a lot of changes. And there's some very key differences in scope and requirements. And the main differences are this, that NIS was primarily targeted on operators of very essential services in very specific sectors. So, for example, energy, transport, healthcare, and so on and so forth. What NIS2 has done is it's broadened the scope significantly to include what's called important entities. And it's added some additional sectors, right, like waste management, postal services, digital service providers, which would include things like social media platforms and cloud services. And it's also added things like space agencies. So you can see they've really broadened the scope here of coverage. And as we'll discuss more and more through this session, is they've removed a lot of ambiguity. If you looked at NIS, you would have had carte blanche to go and create your own response to what you thought the directive alignment was. And that was a big problem. But NIS2 has removed that ambiguity. It's very specific now what it expects you to do, and more importantly, how it expects you to do it.
Well, I think, getting greater specificity is great, because that's always the challenge with sort of the regulatory environment, is when there's ambiguity, it makes it more difficult for you to figure out what you're supposed to do and not do.
Yeah.
You mentioned that sort of it's expanding the coverage, and then and then when we look at DORA, you also mentioned that even if you're not directly related to the financial sector, you still might be have to deal with DORA. How do we know, as an organizational representative, how do I know whether I'm covered by it and have to worry about these or not?
Good question. And as much as the regulators and directive creators have tried really hard to make it easy to understand who does this apply to, they've equally done a very good job at making it difficult. And I'm talking more about DORA because, as I mentioned earlier, there's that whole third-party angle that says if you are a service provider to a DORA regulated entity, then you have to demonstrate how you meet the DORA requirements. So service providers can be anything from facilities companies, right, that provide cleaning services, for example, and have access to ICT systems. That's the key thing. You have digital access to these systems. And it could be service providers, which would be managed security service providers, colo service providers, people that host services for this particular business. And so what you're going to find is if you don't know whether you should follow DORA regulations, you're going to get knocks on the doors from any entity that is under DORA that will have already stress tested which of their third-party suppliers it aligns to. So for DORA, a little bit more tricky, but I think the tribal capability of the industry as it starts to align to DORA before the deadline will start to spread the net as wide as it needs to be spread. NIS2, much more simple in that they've been very prescriptive on the types of organizations and the types of companies that NIS2 aligns to. And so you'll find yourself in one of three buckets. It can be essential, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, critical and important. And so there's a specific list of what they are, and you'll be able to check that and have a look. It does also include the financial market sector too. So a lot of organizations in the financial sector are going to find that they will also have to align to NIS2 in some respects. So that's almost like a double whammy of regulation and directives that they're all going to have to align to. But NIS2 is a bit easier because it does give you some very prescriptive data on who they expect to align in which particular area.
Right. So let's sort of look at that double whammy a little bit. Particularly if you have to do both DORA and NIS2, is there overlap, or are they two completely different things?
So the good news is there is a lot of overlap between the two regulations. I've lived, breathed, and ate both of these regulations for the past sort of 8 to 9 months, and I've got more grey hairs as a result of it. But the goodness of that journey has been I've been able to draw some very direct lines between what DORA and NIS2 similarities are, and it's easiest described in this way. Each of the directive and the regulation both have 5 core domains, And of those 5 core domains, there are 3 almost carbon copy similarities. And of the other 2, there are just minor differences in process and technology deployment. So you'll find that if you are aligning to DORA, you'll have ticked a lot of the boxes around NIS2 and potentially more than you considered. And if you're aligning to NIS2, you'll have ticked a lot of boxes in DORA. So it's good news for those that get hit by both, and equally good news for those that would like to extend to both, because there's certainly no harm in building a significant operational resilience capability and following some of the very specific threat and incident detection reporting mechanisms that NIS2 describes.
Mm-hmm. So are there significant, you sort of mentioned that there were 3 areas where there's good overlap. Are there areas where there's a big difference between what you have to think about and worry about for DORA or NIS2?
Not significantly big differences, and there are differences, no doubt. And if you look at NIS2, and let's talk about those differences because they're the key ones for those listening to this session. So NIS2's big differences are around enhanced cyber risk management. So NIS2 mandates stricter risk assessment frameworks, stricter incident reporting procedures, and very strict supply chain security measures compared to the old NIS. Now, I'm not saying that DORA hasn't got the same controls. It has, but DORA is a little bit broader on the ICT risk management focus. It's all about robust ICT risk management frameworks. It doesn't specifically go into all the details about how you do it, which is where NIS2 is stronger. In addition to the third-party supply chain or supply chain risk, really focus heavily on the financial entity side of things. And there's a lot of differences in how it would want you to monitor and assess the resilience of third-party ICT service providers. Whereas NIS2 wants you to be aware and provide some level of capability of understanding. DORA says, no, you actually have to actively test. There's threat-led pen testing we want you to do to ensure that, A, you're complying and your third party is complying. So it's an ongoing risk management sort of process, if you like, that you'll see will be mandated throughout the relationship with those technology providers. Whereas NIS2 just says you must do it, but there's no specificity on the exact time frameworks. It's just that it has to be done regularly.
Right. Well, I think that, understanding that third-party risk is really, a key. I think we've seen over the past couple of years, actually maybe decades or more even, how your organization may have a really strong cybersecurity posture and really understand what's going on in your environment. But your third-party service providers, if they have a weaker environment, once they are attacked and they have access to your systems, then you still may have big problems. And that was, I don't know, from the United States perspective, where I am, we had a very big attack against the retailer Target years ago. And that was somebody who came in actually through their heating and ventilation contractor. So people who provided maintenance on their air conditioning system somehow had access to the IT environment and were able to, once they were hacked, then Target got hacked, and that led to huge financial losses and reputational damage for Target. So that is a big issue. I think you mentioned earlier, you said something about October of this year. What's sort of the time frame that people have to think about?
Yeah, and so let's talk about NIS2, because the timeline is this October. And a lot of people go, oh my goodness, 17th of October 24, to transpose that directive into an applicable national law, which means that's the date at which it becomes effective. Is that enough time? Well, it should be, right? Because the organizations that are implicated are not the new ones. The new ones are the ones that will struggle a little bit here. Have already gone through a lot of NIS2 directive alignment. So for them, this is just tighten the grip on security measures and so forth as mandated in the directive. And it should be a relatively short journey. And I say short, anywhere between sort of 9 to 12 months. So you do the math, that doesn't leave a great deal of time until the deadline arrives. DORA is more tricky. So DORA is new. Now, there will be a lot of technology capabilities organizations have that might give them a little bit of a head start in the DORA regulation alignment. But from the conversations that I'm having, I don't think the organizations have the head start that I'd hoped they would have had, and nor do they once you start to lift the lid on what DORA actually means. And that deadline's January. And if you look at the industry analysts' data around what's the typical time frame from 0 to hero, from not being aligned to fully aligned and audited and assessed as aligned, it's at best 12 months. These are averages, okay?
Right.
With the worst case being up to 18 months, and sometimes I've seen it go longer. So it really means there's not a great deal of time left. If you're an organization that has to align to DORA, you really have to have had your skates on a long time ago. So I think there'll be a lot of people racing to the post here on this.
I think that's sort of a great place to sort of wrap this up. Any final thoughts that you might want to have to the audience about sort of thinking about DORA and NIS2 overall?
Yeah, absolutely. Take a deep breath. You can achieve it, and there are a lot of tools out there to help you. And we've got many here at Rubrik as well for you to look at. But it is something that you can do. You'll find a lot of the technology you have in place today gets you a significant step forward in regulation against NIS2 and or DORA. And but start the process. If you haven't already, my advice is, make it your number one priority in tandem with ransomware for this year.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
That wraps up today's episode of CISO Conversations, EU Data Regulations. For more insights on navigating data regulations, join us next time when we dive deeper into NIS2 versus DORA and where IT leaders should focus their efforts and resources to turn compliance into a strategic advantage. Rubrik is on a mission to secure the world's data. We help organisations uphold data integrity, deliver data availability that withstands adverse conditions, continuously monitor data risks and threats, and recover their data when they're attacked. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to not miss out on future episodes.